the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Please be seated. When you go to seminary and take classes on preaching, one of the first things they tell you is never put all 3 readings into a sermon and try to link them. So I'm not going to do that. I'm going to give you 3 homilies on each of the little sermon things that are there. And start with the letter from James, which we've been reading the last few weeks, and we only get to read from James every couple of years, so it's worth highlighting. The passage that we heard now is in line with the rest of the letter from James, which is that works really do matter. The line that he ends with, which is that faith by itself, if it has no works, is dead. And he gives a couple of different examples of what that might look like in the real world and also in the Christian community that he's dealing with. I think it was 2 weeks ago, he gave a definition of true religion, which is helping orphans and widows. And today, he gives a specific example of people that are coming into the worship community. And basically, if somebody looks nice and is dressed correctly, they treat them well. And if they're not, they're not. Throughout the history of Christianity, this has happened again and again and again and again. And there's a lot of different ways you can think of it. A modern example of this is people, basically the summary is people are doing good things within their community as long as they get noticed, right? As long as it pays back for them somehow. And a good modern example of this is there's plenty of generous people out there in the world, but imagine someone who was only generous when it made him or her look good, right? Imagine somebody who only gave money to make sure that the plaque was put up afterwards, or only gave money to the hospital if a wing was named after him or her, that sort of thing. So all that is to say, how you live your life, and James is very big on this, how you live your life is a reflection of your faith. And if you're doing a good deed or being generous or being welcoming to somebody, you can do it, you have to do it without being partial to people. You can't do it expecting gain back. It's just a universal thing that you do for everybody. Does that make sense? That's something we can all work on. Every single one of us. And that's really the lesson from the epistle to James. I encourage you to read the whole thing. He gives lots of different examples of how that plays out. And this is just one. It's a fairly short letter, and it is readable in one sit-down. So this week, take some time and read the letter from James. It's a great summary of why the life you live must match up with your faith, or your faith is kind of meaningless. So that's homily number 1. Number 2 is this gospel passage today, which is one of the classic difficult texts in St. Mark's Gospel, at least, because you've got this complicated line where it says, she begged Jesus to cast the demon out of her daughter, and Jesus said to her, let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs. But she answered him, sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. And he said to her, for saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter. It's really hard to escape the reality that Jesus seems to have been very rude to this woman, calling her and her people a dog. And it's important to know the context of it, which doesn't completely take away the difficulty of the text, but at the very least gives you a sense of why this passage is put into our gospel, why we read it, and what it means. So if you step back a little bit and read the entire gospel according to Mark from start to finish, you will discover that Jesus has 2 complete ministry tours in the gospel. The first one, and they're interestingly very similar to each other. The first one includes feeding 5,000 people, casting out demons from different people, healing a woman's son, a child, making somebody who is deaf be able to hear through a miraculous healing, and so forth. The second tour includes feeding 4,000 people, casting out demons, healing a child, and making someone who is deaf be able to hear. And if you read them, these actually happen in the exact same order. And the first one is all to Jewish people in Jewish lands. And the second is all to non-Jews in non-Jew lands. Right? The Jews and then the Gentiles. Two completely different ministries. This particular passage starts off with Jesus going away to Tyre. It's the first time he's gone into Gentile lands. And if you know some of the history and background, and frankly, this is not relegated to history. This happens today. It happens if you go over to the Holy Land, it still happens there, but it happens in our society as well, where people don't like to intermingle with people from a different culture or background or language, right? This is true of all of us. To a degree, we all like to stick to our own. And 2,000 years ago, in Jesus' time, that was sort of a communal thing. People rarely ever left their Jewish community to deal with non-Jews and vice versa. And so it's actually strange that Jesus is in Tyre, in a Gentile land. And his response, as rude as it is, or comes across, is mostly to say that my ministry has not yet gotten this far. My ministry is for Jewish people. And she says, bluntly, right, but the grace of God, we all want this. And so we'll take what we can get. It's that moment right there, if you read the whole gospel, that Jesus' ministry shifts and becomes not just a ministry for Jewish people, but a ministry for all people. And what I would say in terms of a homilette right here is it's surprising that Jesus has gone out of his area. It's surprising that he's having this encounter with this woman. He was probably surprised himself when she approached him and asked for healing, and his answer and her answer are surprising. In your life of faith, be willing to be surprised and be willing to take that surprise maybe as a divine intervention that you weren't expecting today, and do something with it. This changes everything for this woman. The demon is cast out, and it changes everything for Jesus' ministry. It's expanded to all people. What surprises does God have in store for you? Open your ears. That's how the reading ends, right? Listen to the world around you. See what's going on. Maybe God has a surprise that's going to make all the difference in your life. And maybe today or tomorrow or this week, you get to actually turn and make that transition based on what God is doing in your life that's surprising. Number 3 is this passage from Isaiah. Now, normally our readings are, in the summer they line up. Either we have a book and we kind of read through it, or we have a theme and we read through it. So James, we're reading through the book, right? Week after week after week. And sometimes we have that with the Old Testament, where we read the adventures of David and the kings, or we read the adventures of the wisdom writers or the prophets. But this summer, on the track that we are on, our Old Testament reading always matches up with the gospel. It's always designed to sort of prefigure the gospel and give you a snapshot from the Hebrew scriptures of some way that God worked, or some prophecy about how God will work. And you see that play out in Jesus' life. So if you look at this quickly, you'll see that the tail end of this is that in the time that's to come, the eyes of the blind will be opened, and the ears of the deaf unstopped, and the lame will leap like a deer, and the tongue of the speechless sing for joy. That should match up pretty well with this man who has a speech impediment and can't hear, and Jesus heals both of these. So from that perspective, the Isaiah reading is just looked ahead. Now, the week that many of us have just had, you might continue reading and be a little shaken or jarred by the final passage. Waters shall break forth in the wilderness, and streams in the desert. The burning sand shall become a pool, and the thirsty ground springs of water. I have never heard this passage in a negative way until this past week, when water was coming up out of the dry places all over the place. Some of us, you should know. I mean, everybody sees the news, but people in our towns, it was spotty. Sometimes you got nothing, sometimes you got more flooding than you've ever gotten, sometimes it was totally catastrophic, and that includes people in our congregation. So when you hear this, sometimes Bible passages are best heard, once again, with some context. This is from the 35th chapter of Isaiah. It's a poem and an oracle about the future, when things will get better. Most scholars, in the book itself, it's plunked into a section where the Assyrians are coming down, and they will eventually wipe out Judah and Israel. And what's going to happen? Well, after that, when we're all scattered, things will eventually get better, is the point of the prophecy. Most scholars will put this in the time of the Babylonian captivity, when everybody was literally out of their homes and away, and looking forward to a time when they would be able to return and things would come back to normal. So in the context, it's actually a very positive oracle. Think of people that live in sort of a desert, wildernessy world. Water in that is always a good thing. For us, though, we may hear this and think, gosh, this is challenging. When is that good time going to happen to me? And it could be that the flood that happened was really devastating. I know for a number of our congregants it was. It could also be, when is this pandemic that never seems to end going to end? It could be a health issue in your life. At any given time, in any congregation or community, there's always people going through all sorts of horrible things. A friend has died. A spouse has died. A boyfriend has died. My house has been flooded. My car doesn't work anymore. It's gone. I'm going through a divorce. Somebody's sick. Every one of us knows people that are going through these things right now. And it sometimes begins to feel like we're all in our own little Babylonian captivity. When am I going to finally get blessed? I've put in my time of faith. James will tell you it doesn't really work like that, but that's a different issue. But when am I going to get blessed? And the answer that God has is actually three things. One, you never know what tomorrow or next week is going to bring. And those blessings could come in surprises. That's sort of the lesson of the gospel. But two, most often, the blessings that we encounter are actually when the people around us know that we are struggling and reach out and bless us ourselves. Right? Anytime you've ever had a challenge or anything that's been bad, it often is the people of faith and the people in our communities that reach out to support us with love and help and anything they can do. And they mean it when they say, is there anything I can do to help? We've all been on both sides of this. That's often how God blesses us in the darkest times. And the third one is prayer. It's surprises, the blessings of God that were totally unexpected. It's the people around us, and it's the intentionality of prayer. Early on in the pandemic, you may remember, you may not, but I sent out a prayer to the congregation almost every day. If you pull out your red prayer book, I'll show you where it is. It's on page 461 in the prayer book. And it's in a section that's ministry to the sick under a header called Prayers for Use by a Sick Person, page 461 in the prayer book. Now these are prayers that are designed for someone who is sick to pray on their own, so that in those times when either nobody is around to support them or you're just alone because you're alone. These are great prayers. I recommend, they don't need to be for when you're sick. They actually work very well for almost any type of trouble. A prayer for trust in God, a prayer for being in pain, a prayer for sleep. And the last one is a prayer in the morning. And I want you to pray this with me, because in those times where you feel like I cannot get through the next day because it has been so hard today, and we've all had that happen to us more times than any of us care to admit. But I want you to pray this in the morning prayer with me. And remember, it's in our prayer book, because it's something that you probably will turn back to at other times. So let us pray together. This is another day, O Lord. I know not what it will bring forth, but make me ready, Lord, for whatever it may be. If I am to stand up, help me to stand bravely. If I am to sit still, help me to sit quietly. If I am to lie low, help me to do it patiently. And if I am to do nothing, let me do it gallantly. Make these words more than words, and give me the Spirit of Jesus. Amen.